Picture this. A mother, cradling her child in her arms, rushes into an emergency room. Her face is etched with fear, her heart pounding as she pleads for help. But instead of finding care, she's met with cold stares and rejection, not because they lack the means to help, but because of the color of her son's skin. This is the story of Lisa Johnson and her son Dante. What unfolds next is a tale of heartbreak, resilience, and an unexpected revelation that changes everything. It was a calm autumn evening in the small town of Wilman, the kind of evening where the golden hues of the sunset kissed the quiet streets, and the cool breeze carried the scent of freshly fallen leaves. The town was picturesque, but beneath its serene surface there lay unspoken tensions, a deep-rooted history of prejudice that often went unnoticed by those who didn't have to endure it. Inside a modest, well-kept home on the edge of town, Lisa Johnson stood at her kitchen counter, finishing up the dishes from dinner. The faint hum of a news program played in the background, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about her son, Dante, an 8-year-old boy who was the very definition of joy in her life. Dante was a bright, curious child with a love for superheroes and soccer. His laughter could brighten the gloomiest of days, and his boundless energy kept Lisa on her toes. That evening, he was sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by a sea of colorful toys and a half-finished puzzle. Lisa wiped her hands on a dish towel and peeked into the living room, a soft smile spreading across her face. Dante's tiny fingers moved quickly, fitting a puzzle piece into place, his brow furrowed in concentration. She called out to him, her voice warm. "Dante, don't forget to get your things ready for school tomorrow, okay?" He looked up, grinning. "Okay, Mom." It was a simple, ordinary evening. Nothing about it hinted at the chaos that was about to unfold. As the sun dipped lower, Marcus Johnson, Lisa's husband and the town's mayor, was still at a council meeting. His workdays were often long and demanding, filled with endless discussions and debates about how to improve a town that didn't always welcome change. He fought tirelessly for equality and progress, but it was a slow, uphill battle. Just as Lisa was about to settle onto the couch with a book, she heard a faint sound, a small whimper coming from Dante. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward him. He was clutching his stomach, his face pale and contorted in pain. She rushed to his side, kneeling on the floor beside him. "Dante? What's wrong, baby?" "I don't know," he murmured, his voice weak. "My tummy really hurts." Lisa's heart raced. She pressed a hand to his forehead. It was burning hot. Fear gripped her as she tried to stay calm. "Okay, sweetheart. We're going to the hospital. I'll get you help." She moved quickly, grabbing her keys and wrapping Dante in a blanket. The cool night air hit her as she carried him out to the car. His small body felt heavier than usual, his head resting limply on her shoulder. The drive to Wilmot General Hospital felt endless. The quiet hum of the car engine was punctuated by Dante's faint moans. Lisa gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she whispered words of reassurance. "Just hold on, baby. We're almost there. Mommy's got you." When she finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, she didn't even bother to park neatly. She jumped out of the car, carrying Dante in her arms, and rushed through the sliding doors of the emergency room. The bright fluorescent lights of the ER were harsh, contrasting sharply with the darkness outside. Lisa's voice trembled as she approached the front desk. "Please, my son is in pain. He needs help." The receptionist, a young woman with a disinterested expression, looked up briefly from her computer. Her eyes flicked over Lisa and Dante before she spoke in a monotone voice. "Name and insurance information?" Lisa blinked, momentarily stunned by the lack of urgency. "I'll give you whatever you need, but please, my son is really sick. He needs a doctor now." The receptionist sighed, her fingers lazily tapping on the keyboard. "Take a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." Lisa stared at her in disbelief, but turned away, her priority being Dante. She sat down in the waiting area, cradling him in her lap. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half closed. "Stay with me, baby," she whispered, stroking his hair. "We'll get through this." The minutes dragged on. Other patients came and went, but no one called for them. Lisa's anxiety grew with each passing second. She could feel the eyes of others in the waiting room on her, some sympathetic, others curious. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a nurse appeared. "The doctor will see you now." she said, her tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Lisa followed her down a long, sterile hallway, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. She carried Dante into a small examination room and gently laid him on the bed. The nurse left without a word, and Lisa was left alone with her son, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. She waited, her nerves fraying with each passing moment. Lisa sat on the edge of the examination bed, holding Dante's small hand in hers. His breathing was shallow, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead under the harsh fluorescent lights. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of a distant monitor. Each passing second felt like an hour as she waited for the doctor to arrive. The door creaked open, and in walked Dr. Grant. He was tall and middle-aged, his graying hair combed neatly to the side. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over the room before landing on Lisa and Dante. There was no warmth in his gaze, no sense of urgency or concern. He raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, his tone clipped and detached, as though he were being inconvenienced. Lisa rose from the bed, desperation clear in her voice. "My son is in severe pain. He's burning up, and he says his stomach hurts. Please, you have to help him." Dr. Grant glanced at Dante briefly, then turned his attention back to Lisa. His lips thinned into a straight line. "Well, ma'am, let's not overreact. Children complain about stomach aches all the time. What kind of insurance do you have?" Lisa blinked, stunned by the question. She quickly pulled her wallet from her purse and handed over her insurance card, her hands trembling. Dr. Grant took it, his eyes scanning the card briefly before his expression hardened. He handed the card back, his tone even colder than before. "I think you'd be better off taking him to the clinic across town. We're very busy here tonight, and frankly, your insurance doesn't cover much." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the doctor in disbelief, her heart pounding. "Are you saying you won't help my son? Look at him. He's clearly in pain." Dr. Grant sighed, as though he were dealing with an unreasonable customer rather than a desperate mother. "Ma'am, I've already told you. We're understaffed tonight. There's nothing I can do for you here. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other patients to see." He turned to leave, but Lisa stepped forward, blocking his path. Her voice was filled with a mix of anger and fear. "You can't just walk away. He's just a little boy. He needs you." Dr. Grant's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with irritation. "I suggest you calm down, ma'am. If you can't control yourself, I'll have security escort you out." Lisa stood frozen for a moment, her chest heaving with the effort to keep herself composed. Her son's weak whimper pulled her back, and she turned to see Dante clutching his stomach, his face scrunched in pain. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This wasn't the time to break down. "Please," she said, her voice softer but still trembling. "He's just a child. He doesn't deserve this. If you won't help him, then who will?" Dr. Grant's response was a dismissive shrug. "Like I said, try the clinic. Maybe they'll have time for you." Lisa clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. Her eyes darted to the nurse who had accompanied Dr. Grant into the room. The nurse, a young woman with kind eyes, looked torn. For a moment it seemed like she wanted to intervene, but she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. It was clear this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Lisa's mind raced. She thought about leaving, about finding someone else who could help, but she knew time wasn't on her side. Dante's condition was worsening by the minute. She refused to walk out of this hospital without him receiving care. Nearby, a janitor named Mr. Ray was mopping the floor in the hallway. An older black man with years of experience in the hospital, he had seen things like this far too often. He paused, leaning slightly on his mop, and listened to the exchange unfolding in the room. Lisa's voice, now tinged with desperation, carried through the slightly open door. "If you won't help my son, I'll find someone who will. But know this, you'll regret turning him away." Mr. Ray's brow furrowed as he set his mop aside. He didn't know the specifics of the situation, but he could feel the weight of what was happening. Quietly, he stepped away and made his way to the administrator's office. He knocked lightly before entering, speaking in a low, firm tone. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the hospital administrator, Mrs. Stevens, "I think you need to come down to the ER. There's a situation that needs your attention." Back in the examination room, Lisa sat back down beside Dante, stroking his hair and whispering words of comfort. Her hands shook, but her resolve was unyielding. She wasn't going anywhere, not until her son was treated. She could feel the weight of Dr. Grant's disdain, but she refused to let it break her spirit. What Lisa didn't know was that help was already on the way. And what Dr. Grant didn't realize was that his actions that night would soon come back to haunt him. Dr. Grant left the room without another word, his cold demeanor lingering like a bad taste in the air. Lisa stared after him, disbelief etched across her face. She held Dante's hand tighter, feeling his small fingers barely squeeze back. His breathing was shallow now, his eyes fluttering closed as if the pain was too much for him to bear. Lisa's thoughts raced. She couldn't leave the hospital, but staying felt hopeless. A nurse had stood by, saying nothing, and the system seemed determined to fail her. But something deep inside her refused to give up. She whispered to Dante, "I'm here, baby, I'll fight for you, I promise." A few moments later, the door creaked open again, but it wasn't Dr. Grant. Instead, Mr. Ray, the janitor, peeked inside. His eyes were warm and kind, a stark contrast to the indifference Lisa had encountered so far. He stepped in quietly, his mop left behind in the hallway. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I overheard what happened. I've already called the hospital administrator. Just hold on, help's coming." Lisa blinked, her emotions swirling between gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice cracking. Mr. Ray nodded, lingering for a moment before stepping back into the hall. He had worked at the hospital for over 20 years and had seen too many families suffer under the weight of prejudice. He wasn't going to let it slide this time. Minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. Mrs. Stevens, the hospital administrator, appeared in the doorway. She was a sharp, professional woman in her late 50s, with a no-nonsense air about her. She scanned the room, her eyes immediately landing on Dante, who lay pale and motionless on the bed. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice firm. Lisa stood, her relief mixed with anger. "Your doctor refused to treat my son," she said, her words trembling but resolute. "He's in pain, and no one seems to care." Mrs. Stevens' brows knit together as she turned to the nurse, who was still lingering awkwardly by the door. "Where is Dr. Grant?" she asked sharply. The nurse stammered. He said the patient should go to the clinic across town. He said we're too busy tonight." Mrs. Stevens' expression hardened. "Too busy?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Without another word, she strode out of the room, her heels clicking against the floor as she marched toward Dr. Grant's office. Dr. Grant was seated at his desk, casually flipping through a medical journal when Mrs. Stevens stormed in. He looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. "Dr. Grant," she began, her tone icy, "I need an explanation for why you refused to treat a child in the ER tonight." Dr. Grant leaned back in his chair, his demeanor still annoyingly indifferent. "The mother didn't seem to understand that we're understaffed tonight. Besides, I assumed she'd be better off at the clinic." Mrs. Stevens' eyes narrowed. "Better off at the clinic? This is a hospital. That child is in a critical state, and you turned them away because of some baseless assumption? Or was it because of something else?" Dr. Grant's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm only trying to prioritize our resources," he said defensively. Mrs. Stevens didn't buy it. "If you can't prioritize the health of every patient who walks through these doors, you have no business being here. I'll handle this from now on. And Dr. Grant, we'll be having a serious conversation about your future at this hospital." Dr. Grant sat in silence as Mrs. Stevens turned and left the office, her frustration evident in every step. Back in the examination room, Mrs. Stevens returned with 2 additional nurses and a sense of urgency that had been missing all night. She approached Lisa and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're going to take care of your son now," she said, her tone firm but kind. "I'm so sorry for what you've been through." The nurses immediately got to work, checking Dante's vitals and preparing him for an examination. Lisa felt a wave of relief wash over her, though her anger toward Dr. Grant still simmered beneath the surface. Dante's condition was quickly diagnosed as acute appendicitis, and surgery was needed to save him. The team moved swiftly, and within minutes, Dante was being prepped for the operating room. Lisa watched as her son was wheeled away, her heart heavy with worry, but also hope that he was finally in the right hands. As Lisa waited in the corridor, Marcus arrived at the hospital. His face was a mix of worry and determination. Lisa rushed to him, tears streaming down her face as she explained everything that had happened, the pain, the rejection, and the indifference they had faced. Marcus listened quietly, his jaw tightening with each word. When Lisa mentioned Dr. Grant by name, something clicked in Marcus's mind. He remembered overhearing conversations about a doctor who had been the subject of several complaints that had somehow never reached the public. As Marcus paced the hallway, the door to the operating room opened, and Mrs. Stevens stepped out. She approached Marcus, recognizing him immediately. "Mr. Mayor," she began, "I want to personally apologize for what your family has endured tonight. I assure you, the matter is being addressed." Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for stepping in," he said, "but this isn't just about my family. It's about every family that comes through these doors." Stevens nodded solemnly. "You have my word. Things will change." The hallway outside the operating room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of footsteps and the distant hum of machines. Lisa sat on a stiff chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Marcus paced back and forth, his every step echoing through the empty corridor. Neither of them spoke, but the air was thick with tension. Lisa's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Would Dante pull through? Had they brought him to the hospital in time? And what if Dr. Grant's negligence had cost her son precious moments? Each thought made her chest tighten, and she fought to keep herself together. Marcus stopped pacing and knelt in front of Lisa, taking her hands in his. "He's strong," he said, his voice low and steady. "Dante is strong, just like his mom. He'll pull through." Lisa nodded, but her tears betrayed her fear. Marcus, too, was afraid, more than he let on, but he knew he had to be the steady anchor for his family. The door to the operating room swung open, and a nurse stepped out. Both Lisa and Marcus shot to their feet, their eyes fixed on her. She approached with a clipboard in hand, her face unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," she began, her voice calm but serious. "The surgery is going well so far. The appendix was inflamed, but we caught it in time. The doctor is finishing up now, and we'll take Dante to recovery shortly." Relief flooded Lisa's body, and her knees nearly buckled. Marcus steadied her, his hand firm on her arm. "Thank you," he said to the nurse, though his expression remained tense. As the nurse walked away, Marcus turned to Lisa. "He's not out of the woods yet," he said quietly, "but he's fighting. That's all that matters right now." Lisa sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. She whispered a silent prayer, grateful for the small bit of hope the nurse had offered. Meanwhile, Dr. Grant sat in his office, trying to brush off the events of the evening. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through patient charts as though nothing had happened. But his thoughts were restless. He had noticed Mrs. Stevens' sharp tone and the way she'd marched out of his office earlier. He suspected that this time, things wouldn't blow over so easily. His suspicions were confirmed when Marcus entered the room. The mayor's presence was commanding, his usually composed demeanor replaced by a quiet fury. Dr. Grant looked up, startled. "Mr. Mayor," he began, attempting to sound polite. You didn't realize my son's life was in danger?" Marcus interrupted, his voice low but cutting. Dr. Grant's mouth opened and closed as he fumbled for a response. I was under the impression." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "The only impression you had was that my family wasn't worth your time. You looked at my wife, my son, and decided they didn't deserve the care they needed. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Dr. Grant's face flushed, but he said nothing. "You're a doctor," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "Your job is to save lives, not to decide who's worthy of care. Tonight, you didn't just fail my son. You failed every person who walks into this hospital hoping for compassion and fairness." Dr. Grant tried to speak, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. "I'll make sure you're held accountable for this, not just for my family, but for every family you've ever turned away." The silence that followed was heavy, and Dr. Grant sank back into his chair, realizing the gravity of the situation. Hours later, Dante was moved to a recovery room. Lisa and Marcus sat by his bedside, watching his small chest rise and fall with each breath. The sight of him sleeping peacefully brought tears to Lisa's eyes. She gently brushed a curl off his forehead, her heart swelling with both love and relief. As dawn broke over Wilmont, the hospital administrator, Mrs. Stevens, entered the room. She approached Lisa and Marcus with an air of determination. "I want to thank you both for your patience," she began, her tone sincere. "I've already started an internal review of Dr. Grant's actions. He's been suspended pending further investigation, and I assure you, we're taking this very seriously." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "This isn't just about Dr. Grant," he said. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It has to change." Mrs. Stevens agreed. "You have my full support, Mr. Mayor. This hospital will implement mandatory bias training for all staff, and we'll be revising our policies to ensure every patient receives the care they deserve." As she left, Lisa turned to Marcus. "Do you think it'll really make a difference?" Marcus took her hand in his. "It has to," he said. "For Dante, for everyone." Word of the incident spread quickly through the town. The Johnson family's experience became a rallying point for change. Community members came together to demand accountability from the hospital and advocate for broader reforms. Mr. Ray, the janitor who had stepped in to help Lisa, became a local hero. His quiet act of courage inspired others to speak out about the injustices they had faced. At a town hall meeting weeks later, Marcus stood at the podium, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about one doctor or one hospital," he said. "It's about the kind of community we want to be. We can't change the past, but we can fight for a future where no one is treated as less than because of the color of their skin." The audience erupted into applause, a powerful moment of unity in a town that had long been divided. As Dante recovered, Lisa found herself reflecting on the events of that night. The fear, the anger, and the helplessness she'd felt had left a mark on her, but so had the kindness of strangers like Mr. Ray and the determination of her husband. Sitting by Dante's bedside one evening, she whispered softly, "You're going to grow up in a better world, baby. I'll make sure of it." And as the Johnson family moved forward, they carried with them a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to fight for justice, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by prejudice. As the months passed, the Johnson family found a new rhythm in their lives. Dante, now fully recovered, returned to his soccer games and comic book collections, his laughter once again filling their home. Lisa and Marcus, however, knew their work was far from over. What had started as a personal nightmare had grown into a community-wide movement for justice and accountability. The reforms at Wilmot General Hospital began to take shape. New policies ensured that every patient received equal treatment, regardless of race or background. The hospital implemented regular staff training on implicit bias, and a diverse review board was established to handle future complaints. Mrs. Stevens stayed true to her word, working tirelessly to rebuild the hospital's reputation. Dr. Grant's medical license was revoked after the investigation revealed years of misconduct. For many, it was a moment of vindication, though the scars of his actions lingered. The community of Wilmot grew closer in the wake of the incident. People who had remained silent for years began to speak out about their experiences, finding strength in unity. Marcus continued to push for broader changes in healthcare access and equality, using his platform as mayor to shine a light on the systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. Lisa, too, found her voice. She started volunteering with local advocacy groups, helping other families navigate the healthcare system and fight for their rights. Her courage and determination became an inspiration to many. One evening, as the family sat in their living room, Dante turned to his parents. His young voice carried a wisdom beyond his years. "Mom, Dad, do you think things will really change? Not just here, but everywhere?" Marcus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "Change is slow, son, but it starts with people who refuse to give up. People like you, your mom, and everyone who stood with us. As long as we keep fighting, things will get better." Lisa smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "Dante, you showed us all that even in the face of unfairness, we can stand strong, and that strength is what makes the world better, one step at a time." And so, the Johnson family's story became a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up against injustice. They proved that even in the face of adversity, A single voice can spark a movement, and a single act of courage can inspire change. Though the journey was far from over, they knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't stop fighting for a world where every life was valued equally, no matter the color of their skin. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Your support helps us keep telling these important stories. Thank you for watching.